Hi everyone, this is Professor Lubimtseva in GPY for 10 Landscape Analysis and Green Infrastructure. We have arrived to our last lecture of the semester, and today I will talk to you about landscapes in traditional philosophies of space. And more specifically, we will focus on traditional philosophies of space in China and other parts of East and Southeast Asia. Our readings this week include the article in Landscape Ecology by Professor Chen and Professor Wu. You are already familiar with many other scholarly articles by Jianguo Wu, who is a professor at the University of Arizona, and he has written extensively on landscape ecology, sustainability science. And so in this article, we will be exploring connections between landscape ecology and traditional Asian philosophies. I have some optional readings for you. They are also available on the Blackboard in the optional reading folders, including the paper by Mills on Western response to Feng Shui. Feng Shui is a foundation of Asian philosophy of space. And if you want traditional geography and traditional urban planning, as well as the paper by Yu Yang and Yang Zayun, analysis of Feng Shui theory and urban planning in ancient China. If you are really into this topic, there are more optional readings that I would mention at the end of this lecture. So our focus is on Chinese philosophy of unity of man with nature, and we would explore some key principles of unity of man with nature philosophy and concepts such as yin-yang theory and five-element theory, as well as 8 trigram theory, and we'll talk also about Feng Shui and its basic principles. By the way, I will be using lots of my own photos in these lectures, like in all previous lectures. And so this is actually a picture that I took a few years ago during the AEG conference in Japanese Tea Garden in San Francisco. And I will come back to this area a few times, as well as to some other Asian traditional landscapes inspired by traditional Asian philosophy. So let's start by reviewing the mission of landscape architecture and its connections with landscape ecology. As Chen and Wu point in their paper that we are reading this week, landscape architecture encompasses the analysis, planning, design, management, and stewardship of the natural and built environments. And there is a variety of different types of projects that addressed by landscape architecture, that involves residential planning and parks and recreation and monuments and urban design, streetscapes, public spaces, transportation corridors and facilities, all kind of green infrastructure such as garden and arboreta, blue infrastructure such as ponds and lakes and waterfalls, security design, hospitality spaces, resorts, institutional spaces, academic campuses, therapeutical gardens in hospitals and sanatoria, historic preservation, restoration, reclamation, conservation, corporate and commercial spaces, landscape art, earth sculpture, interior landscapes, and so much more. So landscape architecture is really representing on the ground ideas of landscape ecology and concepts and principles of landscape ecology, such as patch dynamic and pattern process and scale relationship, and landscape connectivity can and should be applied in landscape architecture. Landscape architecture is really that nexus where landscape ecology and urban planning are coming together at a variety of different scales. The traditional Chinese and in general Asian philosophy of human environmental interactions is in many ways opposite to the traditional European or Western philosophy of human environmental interactions. In fact, traditional Chinese landscape architecture is rooted in the dialectic philosophy of unity of man with nature. This principle is also informed by yin-yang dualism. suggesting that the opposite energies are always balancing each other. It is also shaped by the ideas and models of peach blossom spring, and we will talk a little bit about what it really means, and world in a pot models that have been a part of Chinese tradition of gardening and landscape design for many thousands of years. It is guided by the principles of five elements, eight trigram, and feng shui. So we're going to explore a little bit more each of these principles, models, and ideas. So the principle of unity of man with nature has been around for a very long time. It goes back at least to 3,000 years ago in the history of Chinese landscape architecture, and probably goes back even further to the time of ancient China. It could be up to 5,000 years. It emphasizes balance and unity. It also promotes the idea that humans need to be nurtured by nature and they are a part of nature. The landscape is seen as a sacred space and spiritual shelter and place of healing. And it's, of course, very relevant. You probably remember our previous conversation about healing and landscape psychology and the way how landscape is affecting our physical and mental health. So in the principle of unity of man and nature, there is really lots of appreciation for these ecosystem services and understanding of the spiritual importance of landscape for human development. Landscape design and planning follow and take advantage of the natural patterns and ecological principles of a particular location in the traditional in the tradition of urban planning and in the tradition of landscape architecture in ancient China. Each site have been developed in very thorough consideration of its natural ecological pattern. And so we're going to look a little bit into how this has been done for thousands of years. Meanwhile, I just want to illustrate this idea with this picture from Zen Garden, from the Japanese garden in Portland in Oregon, that I also took a few years ago. So the peach blossom spring ideal appears frequently in the traditional Chinese painting and also in Korean and Japanese paintings that have been influenced by Chinese culture in early Middle Ages. The peach blossom spring legend appears somewhere around 1500 years ago in China, and it illustrates and represents this ecologically unspoiled and geographically spectacular landscape that includes mountains and water and fertile land and ecosystems and, of course, people who are harmoniously integrated with the natural environment. So this is sort of the ideal landscape with ideal human environmental interactions that inspires our thought process about the landscape should be designed. And you would see this peach blossom spring kind of motif very prominent in the traditional paintings, but also in the traditional landscape and garden design in pretty much everywhere in East Asia, inspired by this tradition. Another interesting traditional model present in landscape architecture of ancient China is the world in a pot model, and we would find this world in the pot model in Chinese and Japanese and Korean gardens, really going back to early Middle Ages or even going back to the time of ancient China. So this infinite imagination and expression of nature in a limited and very often enclosed space can be represented with ponds that are used as models of rivers and oceans, and rocks that represent mountain peaks and ranges, and flowers that represent biological wonders, plants and animals. And these can be replicated at any scale, from the scale of a large garden, or like we are going to look at the Emperor's Garden in Beijing, but you can also see the replication of the same world in the pot model in traditional Japanese bonsai, when this landscape is really in a pot, right, in a very small space, in a vase. It can be replicated at a variety of scales. It can be replicated in a small Zen garden. It can be represented in the landscape at the scale of your backyard or in a larger public space. This traditional Chinese culture acquired the primary characteristics of the principles of unity of man and nature during the spring and autumn period. So it really goes back to like the 8th to 3rd century BC, and then it continued through the Warring States periods, somewhere through the 3rd to the 5th century BC, and it was influenced very much by its birthplace, by the geography and the landscape and climate and landforms of the Yellow River Basin, also known as Guangzhou region. So we see that this tradition really spread from the Yellow River Valley everywhere across China and then everywhere across Asia, and now literally everywhere around the world, because you would find traditional Chinese and Japanese and Korean gardens, of course, in the United States and in many parts of the world where they came much later. There are a variety of different styles based on local landscape features. So really the main idea behind is that the landscape architecture works with the local landscape. So you would find different local materials. You would find gardens that use entirely native species. You would see the landscape that really fits the man-made landscape that very well fit into the natural landscape. Usually at this time of the year, I take this class to Frederick Meyer Gardens to look at examples from the Japanese garden at Meyer's Garden. We cannot use it this year, but you can use the virtual tools on the Meyer Gardens website and look at some examples, or maybe you already had a chance to visit Meyer Gardens. But what I want to emphasize that even here, at Meyer Gardens, also the landscape architect who worked on the garden worked entirely with native species, right? So like the species that we have and the materials that we have in the Japanese garden in Meyer Gardens, those are native species of Michigan, and that would be different in every part of the world. So the traditional Asian gardens would look very different. That can be from xeriscape and from in the areas where it's appropriate to the local dry climate, to very lush vegetation of Okinawa, to temperate forest, temperate species, let's say in northern Japan or in northern China or in Korea. So here is an example again from the Japanese garden in Portland. So this is a kind of prime example of this world in the pot model at kind of medium scale of a small garden. So feng shui theory is very important for understanding landscape architecture in Asia, and all the tradition of landscape architecture in China and other Asian countries. So feng shui stands literally for wind and water, and it consists of a set of empirical principles that integrate biophysical landscape features with cultural traditions and religious beliefs. So you remember that in this class, we have been talking a lot about ABC approach, abiotic, biotic, and cultural components of the landscape. And essentially, feng shui is a very good way to see how all these three groups of components are interrelated within a landscape, let it be anthropogenic landscape or natural landscape. Feng shui principles guide the practice of selecting and designing dwellings or burial spaces or cities, and they work on a variety of different scales, just like we saw that the other models of landscape architecture really work on at a variety of scales. So feng shui principles can work at the scale of individual house or even individual room or individual garden, but they have been used in ancient China for selecting exactly where the city should be built and how the city should be laid out. So this is really sort of the roots of urban planning that go back to over 3,000 years. And the feng shui principles would determine where the wall should be built, where the roads should be built, where the the emperor's palace should be built, where the temples should be built, and so on, how specific houses should be oriented within the landscape in relationship to various landforms, in the relationship to mountains, water, and all other components of the landscape. So feng shui, just like landscape ecology, really works at a variety of different scales. And the theory of feng shui stems from the Taoist yin-yang dualism, the five-element theory, and the eight trigram theory. Feng shui has been widely practiced and is still practiced in China, and now it is really kind of coming back when people start, realizing that there's really lots of it's a very valuable way of bringing together science and spirituality through the nexus of landscape. So feng shui influenced, of course, landscape architecture not only in China but in many neighboring East Asian countries such as Hong Kong and Taiwan and Korea and Japan, of course, and even Vietnam and Thailand and Laos. And as I said, it originates more than 3,000 years ago in the site selection of houses and also burial places in early China. It took shape in Han Jin period and then developed through the Middle Ages during Tang and Song and Yuan dynasties, and then it really approached perfection at Ming and Qin dynasties, and that's the time when it was also brought in Japan and to Korea and to other parts of Asia. Feng Shui involves the examination of the geographical conditions of mountains and water before selecting the auspicious conditions and subsequently building city walls and houses and graves and gardens and parks and pagodas to achieve really this ideal of unity of man and universe. And there are two major schools of feng shui that are sort of interrelated. So really take into account the morphology of the landscape, its topography, its hydrography, but it also take into account the way how this landscape fits into the bigger picture and how it is oriented in space. Feng Shui theory aims to create favorable living conditions by thorough investigating all of the aspects of the natural environment and moderately making use of and transforming nature. So I want to cite this statement from the paper by Young, and I want to especially emphasize that it's really about working with all aspects of natural environment and moderately making use of and transforming nature. So I want to emphasize this word moderately because in the tradition of feng shui, we are not fully modifying the landscape, but we are really humans are working with the landscape. And the job of the urban planner or the job of the landscape architect is really work kind of in concert with, in harmony with the existing landscape features. So feng shui really encompasses the ideas of geology, hydrology, ecology, microclimate, and landscape ecology, environmental aspects of the landscape. I mentioned a couple of times today already the idea of yin and yang dualism, and perhaps you have heard about yin and yang earlier. It's the idea of balanced forces, the masculine and the feminine, in nature or in everything in the universe. And yin-yang dualism is really providing conceptual basis for both the five element and eight trigrams theory that used in feng shui and in traditional landscape architecture vision in East Asian tradition. So these principles really emphasize balancing opposed either natural or man-made processes or forces and organizing evolving parts to achieve the harmony and eternity in the whole landscape or in the whole city or in the whole household. The five element theory further articulates how these 5 essential elements, and we're going to look at them in a minute, comprising the world are related to each other and how they can be arranged properly in the space, how they can be arranged in the landscape to achieve sustainability in that specific location. So there's 5 elements, five elements doctrine, which is guided by the yin yang principle, claim that the material world is composed of metal, wood, water, fire, and earth. And all these elements are related to each other by either creating and being created relationship or a control, being controlled relationship. And by the way, the same principles are also used in acupuncture and traditional Chinese medicine, as well as in Qigong. So 5 element theory, you can connect it to different parts of the landscape, or you can also connect them to different parts of human body. So basically, this is the way to look at the system. Again, there are lots of parallels between the system analysis and the traditional ancient philosophy. So here we see the connections between fire, earth, metal, water, and wood. And you can see how they're controlling each other and also how they are creating each other. Another important theory related to 5 element theory is a trigram, which deals with more components beyond these 5 major elements that make up our world and has been commonly used as a tool in Feng Shui practices. This trigram is often integrated in traditional building design, such as you can see here in the Summer Palace and Imperial Garden in Beijing. Actually took this picture a few years ago visiting Beijing, and it is an amazing complex, including the Emperor's Garden and lakes, and of course the complex of the gardens themselves. The main premise of Feng Shui theory is that the human-environmental relationship can be influenced either positively or negatively by maintaining qi, the vital force or the vital energy that drives all changes in the universe, and of course it drives all changes in the landscape. There are 2 major schools of thought of Feng Shui theory, and the first thought is the thought of form, or the form school, which focuses on the relationship between the morphological features of a landscape and the movement of qi. So it really focuses on the way how water and landforms and buildings are all interrelated and determine the movement of energy within the landscape. The second school is the school of the compass, which bases the analysis of qi on the way how the landscape is organized in space, the landscape orientation, and the landscape orientation in the context of celestial bodies. So think, like we spoke about chorological and topological approach of seeing landscapes. Again, I see lots of similarities, and in Feng Shui, these traditions today are very much interrelated and intermixed. So the landscape is really seen as a whole, as a system, including all its elements, but also including its relationships with everything else outside in the universe. As we are looking at these concepts and theories and different examples, I really want to emphasize the major difference of Western and Eastern tradition in landscape architecture. Western philosophy that we are perhaps more familiar with is, and which is primarily used in this country, is really focused on the idea that the society is influenced by nature, it reacts to nature, and then it also finds a way to control nature through technology and policy. This is kind of traditional approach which is rooted in European school or European tradition of human environmental interactions. Chinese philosophy is very different in the sense that it is really focused on more dialectic quality of socio-ecological relationships, and it is much more holistic, looking at the interplay of man and nature, unity of man and nature. So these differences are reflected in many different ways in the way how we interacting with the nature, how we are seeing the nature, but it's also very clearly reflected in the landscape architecture and in urban planning. Now, I have to remember that China has changed a lot over the past 5,000 years. So the landscape management or environmental management practices that we see today in China are not necessarily rooted in the traditional Chinese philosophy, right? We see the spread of Western practices and Western norms of human environmental interactions driven by the same policies and the same technology today all over the world. So we're really looking here at the differences between the traditional European and traditional East Asian philosophies, not at comparing Europe and China today or the United States and China today. So let's take a look at some examples from traditional gardens, and I'm going to use the Palace of Versailles and also the traditional Japanese and Chinese garden design. So if we look at the Western traditional landscapes, if we look at the Palace of the Gardens of Versailles, for example, you can clearly see that this landscape is focused on demonstrating human control and human dominance and human perseverance. It has no sense of environmental balance at all. It is not making any attempt to show harmony between human and nature. In fact, it's really focusing on dominating the nature, the reshaping the trees in this ridiculous pyramids and cubes and circles, right? The trees are shaped to those geometric figures. You see the landscape, which is dominated by geometric figures that don't really have no place in the natural world. This ideal circles or straight lines or rectangulars. Everything is very ordered, everything is very formal, and it's a completely artificial landscape. Kind of, reached its pinnacle at the time of Louis XIV in France, really suggesting that the king is everything, and that also humans are way much more important than the nature. So very different philosophy, really very much focused on the dominance of technology, the dominance of human over the landscape, over the nature. Let's now take a look at this more traditional landscape shaped by the ideas of Oriental architecture, and we are looking here again at the Japanese tea garden in San Francisco, inspired by those ideas of Chinese and Japanese traditional landscape architecture and principles of feng shui. So we see the landscape which is very much in harmony, in concert with the natural landscape, and in many ways it imitates the natural landscape. It has lots of heterogeneity. It has curvy lines. It uses natural materials. It uses plants that are very similar to the way how they would look in the natural landscape, and it emphasizes proper flow of qi through the environment, following feng shui theory. As Chen and Wu point in their paper, this principle of unity of man and nature and its philosophy of unity of man with nature is really central for sustainability. It's the central pillar of sustainable landscape architecture and urban planning and ecological design, which is based on the ideas of sustainability and landscape ecology. And here you can probably see lots of similarities with previous scholarly papers by Wu that we read at the beginning of the semester, where he was looking at the integration between landscape ecology and sustainability science, and also mentioning the principle of unity of man with nature in traditional Chinese philosophy. So here we see those ideas much more explicit, really showing how sustainable planning conveying the idea of living with nature, not separate from nature, which is really the essence of this principle of unity. A sustainable landscape architecture translates it into the reality on the ground. So the landscape is the nexus of landscape ecology and principle of unity of man with nature, philosophy, and sustainability science. So to develop a sustainable landscape architecture, landscape ecology and sustainability science really need to be integrated into landscape design and planning. And finally, I would like to emphasize three major dimensions of the way how this principle of unity of man with nature and sustainability manifests in the way how we use and how we interact with landscapes around us. So the first principle is the principle of economic sustainability. Of course, you're all familiar with triple bottom line approach or triple bottom model of sustainability. And if we look at the economic sustainability, it's the production of goods and services that generate economic benefits that is happening in the landscape, and it's happening through the variety of ecosystem functions and ecosystem services. In the traditional character in Chinese, which is used for the word garden, is actually literally means fenced place for animals or an enclosed area for vegetables. So this was really the original purpose of the garden, right? It's a place where we grow, edible plants that sustain us. And of course, today this notion has evolved into recognition of many more ecological functions and ecological services that gardens provide and landscapes provide to us. The second major dimension is, of course, the dimension of social sustainability. We know that landscapes provide us with many enrichment services, such as spaces and facilities and opportunities for recreation, spiritual practices, and healthy living and social function, and education and recreation, and so on. So all those ecosystem services that we benefit from as they meet our aesthetical and ethical and cultural needs. And finally, the third dimension, which is perhaps the most important, is the dimension of environmental sustainability, because landscapes, no matter natural or anthropogenic, they are places of ecological conservation. Green infrastructure and blue infrastructure in our cities, or any kind of landscapes, need to maintain adequate levels of biodiversity and provide space for various species, not only for humans. And of course, they are providing very important ecosystem functions for all of us. I kind of want you to live with this three-dimensional idea of the landscape, of the sustainable landscape, which is informed by principles of Chinese philosophy. If you want to know more, there are some other additional suggested readings that I would like to recommend. Of course, you would find the papers by Yang and Zayun on the blackboard. I also cited the dissertation by Yang Wang and the paper by Chen and Nakama, and they're all available in GVSU library. And I can upload those papers on the blackboard as well. Well, email me if you have any questions. And as I said, this is our last lecture of this semester. So have a wonderful Thanksgiving break.